Pastor David Matthews had everything figured out. Seminary graduate, loving family, thriving congregation of 800 members in suburban Atlanta. On Sunday mornings, he stood before packed pews, delivering sermons that moved hearts and changed lives. By Wednesday evening, he was sitting in his car in the church parking lot, hands trembling, unable to walk through those same doors he'd entered with such hope just 5 years earlier. David's story isn't unique. It's become frighteningly common. Every month, approximately 1,500 pastors leave their ministry permanently in the United States alone. That's 18,000 spiritual leaders walking away from their calling each year, a number that would fill a medium-sized city. But here's what makes this crisis truly alarming. For every pastor who leaves, studies suggest 3 more are seriously considering it. The mathematics of this exodus are staggering. Research conducted by the Barna Group reveals that 42% of pastors have seriously considered quitting full-time ministry within the past year. The Hartford Institute for Religion Research found that the average pastoral tenure has dropped to just 3.6 years, compared to 7.2 years in the 1990s. We're witnessing the collapse of what was once considered a lifetime vocation. What's driving this mass departure from the pulpit? The answer lies in a perfect storm of modern pressures that would have been unimaginable to previous generations of clergy. Take Pastor Sarah Chen from Portland, Oregon. She entered ministry with a Master of Divinity degree and $127,000 in student debt. Her starting salary? $32,000 per year. After 5 years of faithful service, multiple continuing education requirements, and inflation eating away at her purchasing power, Sarah was making less in real terms than when she started. She was working 70-hour weeks counseling, preaching, administrating, visiting the sick, conducting funerals, performing marriages, while watching her seminary classmates in other professions buy homes and start families without the crushing weight of financial stress. The economic reality facing modern pastors is brutal. According to the National Association of Evangelicals, the median pastoral salary in America is $50,000 annually. Sounds reasonable until you consider that 78% of pastors hold advanced degrees, often requiring 6 to 8 years of higher education. Compare this to other professions requiring similar education levels. The median salary for lawyers is $127,000. For doctors, it's $208,000. Even social workers with master's degrees average $51,760, with significantly better benefits packages. But money, devastating as financial stress can be, isn't the only culprit in this crisis. Meet Reverend Michael Torres from Phoenix, Arizona. Michael lasted exactly 18 months in his first pastoral position. Not because he couldn't preach, his sermons were powerful and biblical. Not because he lacked pastoral skills. He had a gift for counseling and administration. Michael left because of what researchers call clergy killers, a small but vocal minority of congregants who systematically undermine pastoral authority through gossip, manipulation, and outright hostility. Dr. Kenneth Haugk, author of Antagonists in the Church, estimates that 95% of congregations have at least one antagonistic member, and these individuals are responsible for forcing out thousands of pastors annually. Michael's experience was textbook. Anonymous letters criticizing his preaching style, whisper campaigns about his leadership decisions, public confrontations during board meetings, and finally, a coordinated effort to have him removed over a minor disagreement about the church's music program. The psychological toll was devastating. Michael developed anxiety attacks, insomnia, and what his doctor diagnosed as stress-induced hypertension at age 32. His wife, Jessica, watched her confident, called by God husband transform into someone who questioned his worth, his calling, and his sanity. They left ministry entirely. Michael now works in corporate human resources, earning more money with less stress, but he describes it as burying a piece of my soul. The mental health crisis among clergy has reached epidemic proportions. The Clergy Health Initiative at Duke University conducted the most comprehensive study of pastoral wellness ever undertaken, surveying over 1,700 ministers across multiple denominations. Their findings were shocking. Pastors experience depression at twice the rate of the general population. They're more likely to suffer from anxiety disorders, substance abuse, and what researchers term spiritual dryness, a condition where those whose job it is to nurture faith find themselves spiritually empty. Dr. Ray Jean Proschold-Bell, who led the Duke study, discovered that 11.1% of pastors showed signs of moderate to severe depression, compared to 5.5% in the general population. Even more alarming, 8.7% of pastors reported having suicidal thoughts within the past year. These aren't just statistics. They represent thousands of spiritual leaders suffering in silence, often unable to seek help because admitting mental health struggles could end their careers. The isolation factor compounds these problems exponentially. Unlike other professions where you can confide in colleagues, complain about your boss, or seek peer support, pastors often find themselves utterly alone. Who does a pastor talk to when their marriage is struggling? Who do they confide in when they're doubting their faith? Who provides pastoral care to the pastoral caregiver? Hello, this is Professor Archive, and today we're diving deep into one of the most overlooked crises in modern America. Before we continue this investigation, I'm curious. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location and the time you're watching in the comments. Are you perhaps in ministry yourself, or do you know someone who is? Your perspective could help others understand this crisis better. Reverend Linda Washington from rural Alabama represents another facet of this crisis: the overwhelming scope of modern pastoral responsibilities. Linda serves a congregation of 150 members spread across 3 counties. On any given week, she preaches 2 sermons, teaches Sunday school, leads Wednesday evening Bible study, visits hospitalized members, counsels couples in crisis, manages the church budget, oversees building maintenance, coordinates volunteer schedules, updates the church website, manages social media accounts, and handles all administrative duties. She's essentially functioning as a CEO, CFO, counselor, teacher, public speaker, social worker, and spiritual guide simultaneously. The job description that once focused primarily on preaching and pastoral care has exploded into an impossible maze of expectations. The Hartford Seminary's Hartford Institute for Religion Research found that pastors now spend only 25% of their time on traditional pastoral duties, like preaching and counseling, with the remaining 75% consumed by administrative tasks, technology management, and what researchers call institutional maintenance. The technological revolution has created additional pressures previous generations never faced. Today's pastors are expected to be social media experts, video production specialists, and digital marketing professionals. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated these demands exponentially. Suddenly, pastors who had spent decades perfecting face-to-face ministry were forced to become YouTube creators, Zoom meeting coordinators, and live streaming technicians overnight. Pastor James Kim from Seattle describes the pandemic period as the breaking point for many of us. His small Korean-American congregation went from intimate worship services to complex multi-platform digital productions. James found himself working 16-hour days trying to maintain connection with elderly members who couldn't access technology while simultaneously learning video editing software and managing online donation systems. The stress contributed to his decision to leave ministry after 12 years of faithful service. But perhaps the most insidious factor driving pastors away is what sociologists call moral injury, the psychological damage that occurs when you're forced to perpetuate systems that contradict your deepest values. For many pastors, this manifests in the gap between the gospel they preach and the institutional church they're asked to maintain. Consider the story of Pastor Emma Rodriguez from Houston, Texas. Emma entered ministry with a passion for social justice and serving the marginalized. However, her denomination's policies prohibited her from fully welcoming LGBTQ+ individuals, performing same-sex marriages, or even speaking openly about racial reconciliation. When she tried to address systemic poverty in her community, she was told to stick to spiritual matters. When she attempted to create programs for homeless individuals, board members worried about those people affecting property values. Emma found herself caught between her calling to love all people and institutional expectations that felt increasingly inconsistent with the Jesus she read about in Scripture. the cognitive dissonance became unbearable. She describes it as slowly suffocating my soul while smiling every Sunday morning. The demographic pressures facing clergy are equally concerning. The median age of pastors in America is now 54 years old, and it's rising rapidly. Young people are increasingly reluctant to enter ministry, citing financial concerns, work-life balance issues, and skepticism about institutional religion. Seminary enrollment has declined by 24% over the past decade, according to the Association of Theological Schools. Dr. Ryan Burge, a political scientist and pastor who studies religious trends, notes that we're facing a coming cliff in clergy availability. Rural areas are particularly affected, with some regions experiencing what researchers call pastoral deserts, communities where no ordained clergy are available within reasonable driving distance. The ripple effects of this crisis extend far beyond church buildings. Pastors have historically served as community mental health resources, providing counseling, crisis intervention, and emotional support, particularly in underserved areas. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration recognizes clergy as frontline mental health providers, often serving populations who can't afford professional counseling. When pastors leave, communities lose more than spiritual leadership. They lose trained counselors, community organizers, and often the social safety net that churches provide. Food banks close, homeless shelters lose volunteers, addiction recovery programs shut down, and countless community support systems collapse. The financial impact on families and communities is equally devastating. Dr. Matthew Price, a researcher at the General Theological Seminary, calculated that the average cost of pastoral turnover, including search committees, interim pastoral costs, recruitment expenses, and lost giving during transitions, exceeds $85,000 per departure. Multiply that by 18,000 annual departures, and American churches are losing over $1.5 billion annually to pastoral turnover alone. But there's another cost that's impossible to quantify: the human toll on the families of departing pastors. Jessica Matthews, David's wife from our opening story, describes their experience as grieving a death while everyone around you acts like nothing happened. Pastoral families often invest everything, emotionally, financially, socially, in their ministry communities. When forced to leave, they lose not just employment, but their entire social network, their children's friendships, their sense of purpose, and often their faith itself. The children of pastors face unique challenges that researchers are only beginning to understand. Known as PKs, pastors' kids, they grow up in fishbowls where their behavior reflects on their parents' ministry. They're expected to be perfect examples while dealing with the stress of constant financial uncertainty and their parents' emotional struggles. Studies show that PKs are more likely to experience anxiety, depression, and religious trauma than children in other families. Maria Santos, daughter of a former Pentecostal pastor, describes her childhood as performing Christianity for strangers while watching my dad cry himself to sleep because the church board told him he wasn't spiritual enough. She's now 35, hasn't attended church in 15 years, and describes herself as recovering from Christianity, a phrase that's become common among former ministry families. The theological implications of this crisis are equally troubling. What does it mean for Christianity when its own shepherds are abandoning the flock? How do you reconcile the promise of abundant life with the reality of pastoral suffering? These questions are causing a crisis of faith that extends beyond individual congregations to challenge fundamental assumptions about religious vocation itself. Some denominations are beginning to recognize the severity of this crisis and implement solutions. The United Methodist Church created the Center for Clergy Excellence, which provides coaching, counseling, and continuing education resources. The Presbyterian Church, USA, established sabbatical programs and mental health benefits specifically for clergy. The Southern Baptist Convention, despite its conservative reputation, has launched initiatives addressing pastoral wellness and burnout prevention. These efforts show promise, but remain inadequate to address the scope of the problem. Dr. Carol Howard Merritt, a pastor and researcher who studies clergy wellness, argues that we need a complete reimagining of what pastoral ministry looks like in the 21st century. This includes restructuring compensation packages, redistributing pastoral responsibilities, creating accountability systems for congregational behavior, and fundamentally changing cultural expectations around clergy availability and perfection. Some innovative solutions are emerging from unexpected places. The Fresh Expressions movement encourages bivocational ministry, where pastors maintain secular employment while serving smaller congregations. This approach reduces financial pressure while creating more sustainable work-life balance. Multi-site church models allow single pastoral teams to serve multiple smaller congregations, sharing administrative burdens while maintaining personal pastoral relationships. Technology, often cited as part of the problem, is also enabling solutions. Online counseling platforms specifically designed for clergy provide confidential mental health support. Digital tools automate administrative tasks, freeing pastors for relational ministry. Virtual reality training programs help seminary students develop skills for handling difficult congregational situations before encountering them in real ministry contexts. The House for All Sinners and Saints in Denver, Colorado, represents one model for sustainable ministry. Pastor Nadia Bowles-Weber structured her church with clear boundaries around pastoral availability, shared leadership responsibilities, and transparent communication about mental health struggles. Her congregation has maintained the same pastoral leadership for over a decade, remarkable in an era of rapid turnover. But perhaps the most encouraging development is the growing conversation about this crisis itself. For too long, pastoral suffering was hidden behind smiles and spiritualized as God's plan. Now, researchers, denominational leaders, and pastors themselves are speaking openly about these challenges. The nonprofit organization, Pastors in Transition, provides resources for clergy considering career changes. The book When Narcissism Comes to Church by Chuck DeGroat has become essential reading for understanding and addressing toxic congregational dynamics. The website restorepastor.org offers practical resources for both struggling pastors and the congregations that want to support them better. These initiatives represent hope that the church can learn to care for its caregivers more effectively. Yet, significant challenges remain. The financial structures supporting ministry haven't adapted to modern economic realities. Seminary debt loads continue rising while pastoral salaries stagnate. The cultural expectation that pastors should be available 24/7 persists, despite research showing this leads to burnout and family dysfunction. Most critically, many congregations remain unaware of the severity of this crisis or their role in perpetuating it. The path forward requires honest examination of uncomfortable truths about modern Christianity. Churches that claim to value shepherding must learn to care for their shepherds. Denominations that preach about mental health must provide adequate mental health resources for their clergy. Congregations that teach about forgiveness must learn to forgive their pastors' humanity. This crisis also presents an opportunity to reimagine Christian leadership in healthier, more sustainable ways. Instead of the Lone Ranger pastor model, churches can develop team-based leadership structures. Instead of expecting pastoral perfection, congregations can model grace and vulnerability. Instead of treating pastors as spiritual vending machines, communities can recognize them as fellow travelers on the faith journey. The future of Christian ministry in America depends on addressing this crisis before it reaches a breaking point. Every month that passes without action means another 1,500 spiritual leaders walking away, taking with them years of training, experience, and calling that cannot easily be replaced. But here's what gives me hope. The very fact that we're having this conversation represents progress. Churches that once ignored pastoral suffering are now implementing wellness programs. Seminaries that once focused only on theological training are now teaching self-care and boundary setting. Congregations that once viewed their pastors as superhuman are learning to see them as people deserving of care and respect. If you found this investigation valuable and want to support more content like this, consider sending a super thanks. It really helps us continue diving deep into the stories that matter. And don't forget to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. The silent crisis driving pastors out of ministry isn't just about religion. It's about how we treat people whose job it is to care for others. It's about recognizing that those who heal need healing, Those who comfort need comfort, and those who shepherd need shepherding. Until we learn these lessons, we'll continue losing the very people we depend on for spiritual guidance and community leadership. The question isn't whether this crisis will continue, it's whether we'll respond with the same compassion and urgency we'd show for any other humanitarian emergency. Because that's what this is, a humanitarian emergency hiding in plain sight, affecting thousands of families and millions of community members who depend on pastoral leadership for support, guidance, and hope. The shepherds are leaving the flock. The question now is, what are we going to do about it?